Many of you know I'm a true advocate for taking supplementation to optimize your health, and one of the best things that you can do is to choose the right collagen. It's a building block for your entire body. I was introduced to the Sparkle Wellness product, the Skin Boost Plus, about a year ago, and I've been taking it ever since. Having struggled with growing my hair out while I was prepping for the Mrs. America pageant, the Skin Boost Plus product could not have come at a better time. It's formulated with a special bioactive collagen known as Verisol. Verisol collagen is scientifically proven to reduce the fine lines underneath the eyes, around the mouth, and also grow stronger and healthier hair. It truly is feeding your beauty from the inside out. Skin Boost Plus not only contains the Verisol collagen, but it contains hyaluronic acid as well as vitamin C, which aids in skin health and boosts your immunity. This is super important these days. In addition, Skin Boost Plus Sparkle Wellness offers a collagen supplement formulated for joint health called Joint Boost, and a collagen supplement formulated for promoting lean muscle mass called Muscle Boost. So we've got the Sparkle Collagen, the Muscle Boost, and the Joint Boost. And right now, you can get any of the Sparkle Wellness collagen supplements from Amazon or from their website, which is lovesparkle.life, and you can use my code. It's Dr. Fit, that's DRFIT, and that will get you 20% off their delicious range of collagen products for skin, joint, and muscles. Thank you to Sparkle for your amazing products and for sponsoring the Fit and Fabulous podcast. Welcome to the Fit and Fabulous podcast with Dr. Jaime Seaman. Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Jaime, and welcome back to the Fit and Fabulous podcast. I'm super happy that you're all tuning in today because today we're talking about pregnancy and breastfeeding and nutrition and carbs in pregnancy. And these are topics that you guys message me about all the time, asking all sorts of questions. And I'm bringing on an incredible guest today. You can help us both out by leaving your reviews on Apple Podcasts, downloading this, sharing this with all the women in your life that are considering pregnancy. It's such a valuable topic when we talk about nutrition and pregnancy because it's really impacting people for generations to come. So today I would like to welcome Lily Nichols. She's a registered dietitian and a huge low carb advocate. Lily, welcome to the Fit and Fabulous podcast.
Thank you so much for the invite. This will be fun.
So Lily works as a certified diabetes educator. She's a researcher. She's an author. She's got a passion for evidence-based prenatal nutrition, and that's how I came across her. Her work is so known for being research-focused. It's so thorough. It's critical. And you guys, she calls out the outdated dietary guidelines all the time. She's the co-founder of Women's Health Nutrition Academy. She's an author of 2 books, Real Food for Pregnancy and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And I've got them right here. I'm always telling my patients about them. Her best-selling books have helped so many women, including my own patients, moms, babies. They've been used in university-level maternal nutrition and midwife courses. They've even had a major impact on prenatal nutrition policy internationally. Lily has a blog, an amazing website. You guys should go check it out, lilynicholsrdn.com. Incredible, Lily. I'm so excited to have you here today. So tell us a little bit about your story, how Real Food for Pregnancy ever came to fruition and how we got here.
Well, we'll give the low carb slant on it. I came into this work in prenatal nutrition a little bit by accident with an opportunity to work with the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program, which is also known as Sweet Success. And then worked as the sole dietitian diabetes educator managing a busy perinatology practice with a specialist who had been, a really leading voice in the research in the field in gestational diabetes for like 30 years. Okay, so like kind of a big role.
Yeah.
So my day in and day out was like all day long gestational diabetes because all the other clinics would refer their clients to us. They didn't know what to do with gestational diabetes. And I was given kind of free rein to improve upon what had been, standard of care nutrition in that facility. And as a good rule-abiding dietitian at first, I did follow the guidelines with my clients there, and lo and behold, significant percentage failed diet therapy. I had already been, in the real food ancestral scene for a long time before I even went through my dietetic internship. So, I didn't really see the nutrition world with rose-colored glasses like a lot of dietitians. I wasn't naive, and I certainly had started experimenting with lowering my carbohydrate intake at that time. So it just kind of didn't make sense to me why the guidelines would recommend 175 grams of carbohydrates per day as a minimum when these clients had just failed a glucose tolerance test and had carbohydrate intolerance of pregnancy. That's one of the ways you can define gestational diabetes. So that started off a very long journey of diving into the research to understand where these guidelines came from, how evidence-based were they or not? Would it be safe to go lower carb in pregnancy? Oh my God, what about ketosis? Everybody says it's going to harm fetal brain development and have all these adverse effects. And all of that eventually led me to developing a different approach for different nutrition intervention for gestational diabetes, which actually worked quite a bit better. We reduced our rates of medication and insulin use by at least 50%, way fewer adverse outcomes. Typically a poorly managed gestational diabetes case, it might be heavily medically managed and they might be getting nutrition information, but if it's the wrong intervention for them, you're going to have crazy blood sugar swings. It predisposes you to many other complications. So suddenly we stopped having very many clients developing preeclampsia. The rates of so-called big babies went way down. The hospital was like, these aren't typical gestational diabetes cases. Yeah. These aren't GD babies that we're used to seeing. So everything got significantly better, and that led me to write Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And then several years after a lot of pestering to write a general prenatal nutrition book, I started the work on Real Food for Pregnancy. And that kind of expanded to really diving into critically looking at the guidelines from many other angles beyond just carbohydrates and the handful of things that I was addressing in the gestational diabetes book. And yeah, that's where we are today. I'm still advocating for, well, let's look at the data here and see what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. It takes a long time for nutrition guidelines to get updated. There's a huge gap between new research and it making its way into clinical practice and becoming the norm. And I know, having worked at the public policy level, you're up against a lot of bureaucracy. I mean, tiny, microscopic little changes to guidelines will take 6 months of meetings and back and forth that just goes round and round in circles, and ultimately major decisions, major changes usually aren't made. So I'm like, I'm just going to go at this from a grassroots level. I don't think it's worth the stress and turmoil to try to get it changed from a top down. Let's do it from the bottom up, empower clients and clinicians from the ground level, and maybe they can collectively advocate for more change. But certainly my voice is of more value from this angle than it ever was in a policy angle.
Yeah, it's incredible. When I first entered this space, completely on a very personal level, I felt like the black sheep of doctors. And I just mentioned right before we started recording that I feel like I'm probably one of the only low carb, advocate OBGYNs. I do have other colleagues, some MFMs that are very supportive, some reproductive endocrinologists that are starting to use these types of therapies, especially for things like PCOS. But Lily's book, you guys, is amazing because although it's titled Real Food for Pregnancy, it's not just about food. There's so many other great things in here talking about chemical exposure in pregnancy and exercise in pregnancy and so many other things. So if you haven't checked out this book, go check it out. But Lily, can you talk about, I have a background in nutrition before I went to medical school, which is different than a lot of my colleagues as well. And why I probably like playing in this space a little bit, but yeah. I sat through a lot of classes that, with all my registered dietitian friends, and I can't figure out why they hate low carb and ketogenic diets so passionately sometimes, because even in my own community, I mean, it's crazy what patients will come to me and they'll say, my dietitian said XYZ. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
I honestly, well, I feel the same way because I went through conventional dietetics training and a conventional hospital internship at a huge hospital in LA. Like I have heard all of the arguments against it as well. And I was lucky to have a couple dietitian mentors who were already in the low carb space early on to kind of like mentor me through some of these questions and concerns. I think a lot of it stems from, well, first taking the dietary guidelines as law, as unquestionable, because by default, if you reduce the carbohydrates in your diet, you have to replace the calories with something. And generally speaking, yes, protein's important, but you can only increase protein as a proportion of your energy intake to a small degree, right? It's really hard to get more than like, gosh, even getting above 25% protein, 30% protein's really pushing it. A lot of the dietary intervention studies that get people like assign a 30% protein diet, that people end up eating maybe 25, 26%. It's a self-limiting food. So what is the makeup of the rest of the diet when you reduce carbs? It comes from fat. Mm-hmm. And of course, like the whole foundation of dietetics is built upon this idea that fat is not healthy for you, or at least not healthy for you if you start getting beyond 30 or maybe 35% of calories from fat. Oh no, like everything is based around being low fat. Certainly our guidelines have historically been based around limiting saturated fat and cholesterol. So naturally, if you're going to increase your fat from animal sources, like all the red flags go off. Oh my gosh, you're going to have horrible cholesterol levels and predispose yourself to heart disease. And so there's that aspect of it. The other aspect of it is there is a lack of education surrounding physiological energy balance in the body. Mm-hmm. And basically the only training that you get on ketones, and this includes the diabetes educator training, which is actually pretty in-depth, terrible nutrition information in that, but nonetheless, like very in-depth. The only information really given about ketosis is from the standpoint of diabetic ketoacidosis, mm-hmm. which is indeed a medical emergency that you want to avoid, but you don't see that in the general public, and that's not something that's induced by a low carb diet. So there's no understanding or discussion of physiological ketosis. And then one more thing I want to add, because just for the sake of completeness, is that when we do talk about ketogenic diets, it is very much limited to the use of like classical, very strict ketogenic diets used for the treatment of epilepsy and seizures. So if dietitians have any understanding of that, then that's what they think a ketogenic diet is. And that diet is actually a really poor diet. It's protein deficient by design. That would definitely be unsafe in pregnancy. Carbs are extremely restricted, like beyond levels that a general normal person would probably need to do. I mean, we're talking 90% of calories coming from fat. That means the remaining 10% of your diet is split between protein and carbs. It's very imbalanced, but it's not a reflection of a well-balanced real food diet that happens to be lower in carbohydrates. So I think there's like a definition of terms issue where people don't understand the full spectrum of low carbohydrate diets, and rarely in regular life are we going to be putting people on like a therapeutic for the treatment of epilepsy type of ketogenic diet. And certainly that type of ketogenic diet wouldn't be appropriate for pregnancy.
Yeah, absolutely. People are always, sending me questions, is the ketogenic diet safe in pregnancy? And it's like, it's not a one sentence answer, because right. Ketosis isn't necessarily the goal, but normal glycemia and normal insulin levels is. And I've talked about this on podcasts before too, is you can have normal blood glucose levels, but at the cost of what amount of insulin? And we know that hyperinsulinemia itself is a driver of big babies and preeclampsia. And so it really matters. So let's talk about these macronutrients, carbs, protein, and fat. What advice do you have for people how many carbs, how much protein? Because I know I've heard you talk about it before, that it's the protein requirements are much higher than what's recommended. And I have to talk to my patients about that all the time.
Yeah, and I will say that I think over the years, my approach to this has shifted a little bit, and that I used to like prioritize the reducing the carbs, and now I prioritize increasing the protein, which
Hmm.
naturally helps with satiety and blood sugar balance to the level that people have fewer cravings and are simply less hungry for the
Totally.
carbohydrates. So it kind of gets the train rolling without focusing on restriction, but nonetheless, we'll start with protein for that reason. You know, the dietary guidelines on protein are woefully inadequate, I believe, for all life stages. But for pregnancy in particular, the first ever study that directly estimated protein requirements in pregnancy was performed in 2015. Prior to that, it's all a guesstimate, mostly based on studies on adult men, right? So how does that extrapolate to pregnancy? Well, it turns out in that 2015 study, they found that our guidelines are a significant underestimate of true protein requirements. So about 39% too low in early pregnancy, 73% too low in later pregnancy. So essentially, you're looking at consuming mostly like athletic level of carbohydrates. Um, sorry, I'm suddenly getting feedback in my, so it threw me off. I started hearing myself.
You sound okay to me.
Okay, I'm gonna start over whatever that sentence was because I was getting all this reverberation of my own voice. I was like, what is happening? Um, okay, so you're looking at getting essentially the amount of protein that an athlete would require. Um, Certainly, if you are an athlete, you'll require even more protein than what that study found, but you definitely want to prioritize that. And ultimately, that ends up looking like about a quarter of your diet is coming from protein. As for carbohydrates, I'm personally of the belief that we should eat to our own personal carbohydrate tolerance, some of which you can figure out by blood sugar testing to see what your response is. So I don't automatically recommend everybody eats really low carb. However, I find the majority of people do not need 175 grams of carbohydrates per day. There are exceptions to the rule, okay? There are people who come into pregnancy like very underweight and very athletic and like a history of hypothalamic amenorrhea, and they actually really need more carbs because their energy requirements are high and they're actually still in a state of repletion, plus they're pregnant and they have all these energy demands. But the average person, and especially the average woman who's coming into pregnancy with a BMI greater than 25, greater than 30, a carbohydrate level beyond like 150, and sometimes you have to go lower than that, does exceed their personal carbohydrate tolerance, meaning it just spikes their blood sugar way too much. So I often put people for total carbs somewhere in the range of like 90 to 150 grams in pregnancy. Sometimes we go lower if we need to. If you start getting too low in carbs, sometimes you can end up with some imbalances in micronutrient intake. And so I try not to overtly just choose a very low carbohydrate level for the heck of it. But it can be done and can be done in a balanced way if you're careful about it. As we both know, macronutrients aren't everything. You can have a macronutrient ratio that looks good to some people and a caloric intake that looks good, but it's based on like processed keto bars and stuff. And certainly you're going to set yourself up for an issue versus somebody who's having like spinach and eggs for breakfast over some processed keto bar that's really low in micronutrients. And then ultimately the rest of the diet is made up of fat. I find that just based on, carb levels, I'm rarely exceeding 25-30% of calories from carbohydrates. So that means the rest of the diet, about half in terms of calories, comes from fat. And that sounds really extreme to people until they realize that if you're eating like a normal diet, it's actually pretty hard to get below like 40% of calories from fat. We're not talking like you need to eat sticks of butter all day, but just cook normally with enough fat to make your vegetables taste good. Don't take the fat out of all your food. Don't do low fat dairy products, eat full fat. Don't take the yolks out of your eggs. Don't take the skin off of your chicken. Those simple things alone, without adding massive quantities of added fat, naturally pretty easily gets you to about half of your calories from fat. And that seems to work the best in terms of not only like just caloric intake and satiety and blood sugar balance, but also meeting the higher micronutrient requirements of pregnancy it gets pretty challenging to do that, especially if your protein-rich foods are limited, especially the animal proteins. And those naturally come packaged with some fat, right? So it all kind of balances out.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you talk about fats a little bit more? Saturated fat in general has really been vilified for years, but it's actually extremely important in pregnancy. So can you talk about, just hit that again with like red meat and eggs and these types of saturated fat sources in pregnancy?
Yeah, sure. And this is probably one of the more controversial points, because people are they've had it drilled into their head for years and years that saturated fat and cholesterol will increase your risk of heart disease. And therefore, that's the only thing that they focus on. Even though you do look at a lot of recent data, some pretty huge meta-analyses, and there's no reliable correlation, especially for dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol levels, or heart disease risk. And some of those studies find an inverse relationship. So higher intake of saturated fat and cholesterol is associated with a lower risk of stroke, for example. Nobody wants to talk about that. Beyond that, like, that whole thing needs to be debunked. And that has been the topic of many, many other books other than mine that are worth checking out. We need to look at where we get the micronutrients required for pregnancy. So micronutrients being your vitamins, minerals, and then some like specific other nutrients that don't necessarily fit into those categories, like some essential fatty acids like omega-3s, choline, things like that. And when you build a diet around getting sufficient amounts of those nutrients, naturally you sort of just end up with the macronutrient ratio that I've talked about, where a fair percentage of your energy intake is coming from fat. And also you're getting a significant amount of cholesterol in your diet. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. All of your sex steroid hormones are built on a backbone of cholesterol. And there have been studies, controlled feeding studies, where they give one group of women a low fat, low cholesterol diet and the other group a regular diet. And you see levels of estrogen, progesterone tank on the low fat diet. So pregnancy is a time of increased hormone production, increased hormone requirements. We do need to support that from sort of like a basic structural scenario of just providing the raw backbone for creating those hormones, but also the foods that naturally are high in cholesterol, for example, like egg yolks and liver, are some of our most nutrient dense foods. Those are the ones that contain top 2 highest sources of choline, which is a B vitamin-like nutrient that's important for normal placental function, prevention of preeclampsia, prevention of neural tube defects, optimizing baby's brain development. It's almost impossible to meet your choline needs if you're not including things like egg yolks in your diet. And so if you're only looking at it from this very reductionist perspective of, I have to minimize my intake of saturated fat and cholesterol over any other considerations, then you're going to set yourself up for nutrient deficiencies. Choline's just one example. I could pick and choose from a dozen more. Talk about retinol, like the bioactive form of vitamin A, or heme iron, or vitamin B12, or, you can go on, but these are considerations that a lot of people don't think through. It's just low fat is better, do low fat.
Yeah. I mean, if you're eating 40, 50, 60% of your calories from carbohydrates, you're never going to meet choline requirements. And choline was one that, recently they've really come out and said, the recommended daily intake should be a lot higher for pregnant women. Right. And in prenatal vitamins, it's massively underdosed. I mean, if you're not getting it from your diet, it's not like the prenatal vitamin doesn't even fill the gap. Can you talk about prenatal vitamins? Like, do you think they're actually required for pregnant patients, or what do you tell them?
I think it depends on the client. So in a perfect world, we'd be getting all of our nutrients from food. I mean, vitamin supplements are a newfangled thing in human history. We didn't even have folate isolated until like 1941. We didn't have, vitamin B12 supplements until the 1970s. So what did we do prior to that? I mean, everybody got their nutrients from food. Of course, I think we're in a situation where a lot of people are not eating optimally. They're not entering pregnancy nutrient sufficient. I mean, especially the people who've been limiting their animal food intake for a very long time, which is a growing percentage of the population. you may already have some deficits in nutrients like vitamin B12, choline, iron, copper, vitamin A, you could go on and on, where if you're not, eating super optimally, you might not get there, and or you might need more for repletion. So I kind of look at prenatal vitamins as an insurance policy of sorts. It sort of makes up for any holes in the diet. If you have any specific things, foods that you really don't like, or not eating for whatever reason, that can kind of fill in some of those gaps for you as well. Say you're not, a big consumer of seafood, then having like an omega-3 supplement makes a lot of sense. Somebody who's eating 12 ounces of seafood a week might not need that extra DHA because they're getting it from their food. There can also be periods in pregnancy where you're just not able to eat as balanced of a diet as you'd like, such as the first trimester with nausea and food aversions. And therefore, that can be kind of a stand-in to fill in the gaps during that period of time. But I think more so than anything, if you are looking at a prenatal, you just want to understand that there's no universal definition of what counts as a prenatal vitamin. That's not a regulated term. Anything can call itself a prenatal vitamin. And so there's a huge array of quality on the market. If you're looking for one that actually provides especially sufficient amounts of really bulky nutrients, like a lot of minerals, like magnesium, for example, or sufficient amounts of choline, that's another really bulky nutrient, meaning it just takes up a lot of physical space in the capsules, you are probably looking at a supplement that's multiple capsules per day. It's probably not going to fit in a 1 a day or even a 3 a day, maybe not even a 4 a day. It could be like a 6 to 8 a day capsule dose. It really depends on which nutrients you need to fill in the gaps on, and how balanced your diet is, from the get-go.
Yeah. I've had patients bring in different prenatals and they're like, it's 8 capsules a day. Is that right? Like, yeah, it must have a lot of stuff in it. Yeah. Can we talk about the debate with folate and folic acid? That's one that confuses a lot of people.
Yeah, this is another controversial one. I will start by saying you might get some flack from there's some very outspoken OBs out there who really do not like this conversation. We won't go there, but I do have an article on my website that goes into a lot of detail on folate and folic acid. And I actually also have a practitioner webinar that's 2 hours long going through the data on this, because it's like, this is so controversial and a hill that so many practitioners, for I don't know what reason, are willing to die on, that you really have to back yourself up with like 300 freaking references to get people to take you seriously. The issue with folate and folic acid, so folate is an umbrella term. There's many different types of folate that naturally occur, at least 150 different types in food, most of which is in the form of methylfolate, however. And then there's also synthetic types of folate that's known as folic acid. So those all fall under the umbrella of folate, and the metabolism of them in the body is just a little bit different. Folic acid requires some additional steps to make it usable by your system. I think this has become more discussed because one of the enzymes you need to activate, so to speak, folic acid is called MTHFR. And people who have a genetic variation in the way their MTHFR enzyme functions aren't as efficient in how they use folic acid. And therefore, in those cases, those clients often do better with methylfolate, because methylfolate's already been methylated. You kind of bypass that step. And it can function in your body for all the other things that folate needs to do without like having this rate limiting step. I think the reason that it becomes controversial, though, is that the majority of the data that we have on folate and its benefits in pregnancy centers around the reduction in neural tube defects. These occur very early in pregnancy, early in the first trimester, oftentimes before a lot of women even know they're pregnant, by the way. And so those studies have shown that folic acid, is effective at reducing the risk of neural tube defects. I'm not going to argue that there's no benefit whatsoever to folic acid, But I do want to point out that 40 to 60% of the population has some sort of variation in their MTHFR enzyme. And those people, if you take too much folic acid, it can actually block the conversion and create a sort of bottleneck in your folate and methylation cycles, which, then would not be of benefit for reducing the risk of neural tube defects. In fact, 30% of neural tube defects are so-called folic acid resistant, meaning those women were taking sufficient amounts of folic acid and they still had a baby with a neural tube defect. And that points to the bigger conversation, is that we're very single focused on nutrients and we don't consider how they work together. And we actually don't know the exact mechanism that folic acid reduces the risk of neural tube defects, but it's likely by how it improves your body's methylation cycle. And your methylation cycle, which is part of your folate cycle, requires a lot of different nutrients like vitamin B12, riboflavin, vitamin B6, choline, glycine, sufficient protein intake, and many others. And we've shown in lots of research that sufficient amounts of those nutrients also reduces the risk of neural tube defects. So I think it's just part of a bigger conversation. I don't know how much time you want to spend on it, but I think for the people who are diehard, folic acid is the only proven form of folate to reduce the risk of neural tube defects. They're looking at a very narrow view of the data that we have on things. Just because we don't have a randomized controlled trial on methylfolate, and I actually talk about that in both my article and the webinar, the reasons why, because a lot of this has to do with money and funding. Just because we don't have a randomized controlled trial doesn't mean that it's ineffective. And you could still, like, most women are getting plenty of folic acid from their diet already, because it's put in all the refined grain products for the most part.
Right.
So average intake of folic acid is already like 300 milligrams per day. Why would we not consider the usefulness of methylfolate, which not only is that the most prevalent form of folate in our food, certainly prior to the introduction of folic acid supplements, every single pregnancy was not complicated by neural tube defects, first of all. But second of all, that's the form of folate that your body prefers. 95 to 98% of the folate in your red blood stream, in cord blood, meaning baby's blood supply, is methylfolate. So like, I don't know why there's such controversy over supplementing with the one that's already metabolically active versus one that your body has to go through a lot of other steps to make it useful.
I only use methylfolate in my practice. I found out after my 3 pregnancies that I have MTHFR. I've actually had elevated homocysteine levels, even if I am not, I don't eat a lot of fresh liver, but if I'm not getting enough of it, sometimes with supplementation, my homocysteine will go up. So, I mean, I don't want to get down in the weeds for all, the listeners, but just know that there is a difference. There could be dangers with high dose folic acid supplementation. And in people who have had a history, diabetics, there are OBGYNs prescribing, 2000 micrograms of folic acid. And so I want people to
5,000 micrograms, which, by the way, the upper limit for being so conservative about going outside of guidelines. I find it very interesting that we have so many reproductive endocrinologists prescribing 5,000 micrograms of folic acid, which is 5 times the established upper limit for folic acid. You're going to create a lot of other nutrient utilization problems if you're supplementing with super high amounts. And in fact, to the homocysteine point, one of the studies I point out in the article was from a woman who was supplemented with 5,000 micrograms of folic acid. Her homocysteine went up. I think it was something like 40%. Her team switched her to a lower dose of methylfolate, only 500 micrograms of methylfolate. That's right around what the RDA would be, right? The RDA is somewhere between 400 to 600 micrograms of folate, and her homocysteine went down to normal. So, you don't need to mega dose with like a crappy form of a nutrient to fix a deficiency problem. You need to supplement or take in enough of the active form of the nutrient, and you can avoid a lot of other carryover issues. I mean, elevated homocysteine is in itself a risk factor for neural tube defects, miscarriage, and a bunch of other pregnancy complications. So it's like, again, it's tunnel vision. People aren't willing to look outside of their pre-established box. It's uncomfortable to think that maybe what you've been recommending for years or what you've publicly based your entire platform on might be incorrect. It's uncomfortable. And I've had to face that myself with a lot of other topics that I felt like I had the answer on, and then I didn't. It's very humbling. And I think more people would benefit from just taking a step back and sometimes not assuming they're always the expert on things if they don't understand nutrient metabolism and methylation at a deeper level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So I feel like the 2021, 2022 plant-based diets, that's like all we're hearing about now. And I'm seeing it a lot amongst my colleagues, amongst my OBGYN colleagues, especially. I have a fear with the plant-based movement that obviously is very politicized, but that it will just further push people away from eating nutrient-dense animal foods and healthy fats, and will really honestly push them towards more processed carbohydrates. Can you talk about just some of the dangers of like vegan, vegetarian, plant-based diets in pregnancy?
Yeah, this is, I feel like every week there's like some new thing that's become too controversial or too politicized to talk about. It's just funny that it is entering into the nutrition space so much now. But my concern with a vegetarian diet, first off, there's macronutrient and blood sugar considerations. Overall, vegetarians tend to eat a lower percentage of their diet from protein. It's usually somewhere about 11 to 12%, and a pretty high carbohydrate intake, typically 50 to 60%. And then, although their fat intake is low, naturally, even if they're not eating a ton of vegetable oils, it tends to favor a high omega-6 intake and low omega-3s, because most of our omega-3s are from fatty fish and seafood. Certainly the bioavailable ones are solely from fatty fish and seafood, with the exception of algae-based DHA supplements. So from a blood sugar perspective, especially with the gestational diabetes work I've done, some of the most challenging cases have been in clients who are vegetarian. Blood sugar swings all over the map simply because the carbohydrate intake is so high, and most of your vegetarian sources of protein also naturally come with a source of carbohydrate. So your beans and lentils, although I actually don't have a problem with beans and lentils, they are a nutritious food, and probably one of your better protein options on a vegetarian diet. You're also adding to your carbohydrate load. So you combine those beans and legumes with rice or corn or bread or whatever, plus a piece of fruit, plus whatever else is at the meal, and then just considering the portion sizes that you need to like reach satiety. Oftentimes you're looking at 60, 75 grams plus of carbohydrates per meal, relative to a kind of small amount of protein, often, less than 15 grams or so per meal on a typical vegetarian meal plan. So from a blood sugar perspective, not always the best. There are some ways to kind of work around that, maybe supplemental, like vegetarian, vegan protein powders. If you eat eggs and dairy products, more eggs and dairy products relative to the plant sources. Nuts and seeds are a lower carb protein source, but it is a challenge. It does provide a different ratio of amino acids, and it's missing some amino acids that you would find on an omnivorous diet, which new research is telling us might actually be essential to consume in our diet during pregnancy. I have an article on protein and pregnancy on my website. People can check out if they want to dive into those amino acids a little more. But my major concern beyond the macronutrient ratio, which again, you could do some legwork to try to make that work, is the micronutrient issues. So there's 4 major issues. So certain nutrients can be missing from your diet if you have no animal foods whatsoever, like vitamin B12. You can have nutrients that are provided, but not in sufficient amounts in plant foods: choline, glycine, vitamin K2, unless you're a big eater of natto, a fermented soy product. Certain nutrients might not be as well absorbed. Iron and zinc are perfect examples. So you do tend to see higher rates of anemia or just iron dysregulation in vegetarians, particularly vegans, because they're not absorbing and utilizing the iron very well. Zinc as well. I mean, you just have so many compounds in plant foods that are inhibiting the absorption of those, like phytates, oxalates. So many things are getting in the way of the absorption that they actually set the requirements for iron and zinc higher for vegetarians or vegans. So if you're just following the RDA, by the way, you have to calculate up by at least 50% on those. And then the last one is that certain nutrients might not be provided in a form that your body can utilize or convert. And the two major examples of this are the omega-3 fats. So you do get omega-3 fats in plant foods like walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds, etc. But that's in a form called ALA. And the form that your body needs is DHA. That's the one that is required for fetal brain development. And the conversion factor on that is super low. It's like less than 3% for most people, especially if you're eating a high omega-6 diet, which is basically a guarantee on a plant-based diet. And the last example of this would be beta carotene and its conversion to vitamin A in its bioactive form, retinol. Conversion rate on that is super low. And much like the issue with folate, folic acid conversion with MTHFR, there's another genetic variation that can impact this conversion. And some of the people who have a more severe form of this, it's called BCMO1, they can convert such a low amount of beta carotene to vitamin A that it's impossible to meet their vitamin A requirements from plant foods alone, like carrots and sweet potatoes and kale and whatnot. They might only convert 9% of the expected amount.
That gene. I did the Nutrigenomics testing a couple of years ago after I had been low carb and felt so amazing and reversed my own pre-diabetes. And the BCMO1 gene, I don't convert plant omega-3s, retinol. I mean, I have MTHFR, like going down the list, it was like, okay, this is probably why I feel so amazing eating an animal-based diet.
Yeah,
I mean, it was
absolutely
mind-blowing to me. And thank God I have 3 healthy children, because I did not eat this way in my pregnancies. Like, I failed all my glucose testing. Like, I was a horrible patient. Most doctors are. But yeah, I mean, patients, they don't know that they have these, predispositions, and then it's, it's scary, honestly.
And then nobody's doing this genetic testing. So it's like, it's one thing if you did all the genetic testing and you're a genetic unicorn, you have none of those factors, and you might be one of those people who feels well on a plant-based diet, which by all means, if you feel well and you're supplementing things, fine. But so many people have these issues. I mean, it's about half the population who have that vitamin A issue. So it's kind of playing Russian roulette. You never know what you get. Most clinicians aren't testing for this. So it's like, you can play it safe and at least consume some animal foods. Certainly if you feel really strongly about staying vegetarian, you could eat a lot more dairy products. You could have a lot more eggs with the yolks. That fills in a significant amount of the gaps. You could fill in even more if you bend the rules a little bit and include some shellfish and some like bone broth maybe. And some people are willing to do that. But it gets very challenging. It's to the level that for me, I can't ethically endorse a vegan diet during pregnancy. There's too many unknowns. I don't feel comfortable saying that is appropriate for everybody. Maybe if I had like that super detailed genetic panel on somebody and like a history of their micronutrient status, I might feel otherwise. But as a general recommendation, I don't feel comfortable saying that's a good idea.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So let's talk about vitamin A just a little bit in liver, because in your book, you talk about some of the superfoods in pregnancy, like eggs, liver, bone broth, these nutrient dense animal foods. Liver obviously is another controversial topic. Can you talk about like vitamin A toxicity in liver and how much should a pregnant woman be eating?
Yes, this is another one I just wrote an article on. It's on my website. If you want to search liver and organ meat, it should pop right up on the search bar there. So organ meats, they're one of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. You look at a nutritional breakdown of organ meats, particularly liver, and it's just off the charts in tons of nutrients. Folate, by the way, liver is the richest source of folate. Sure, everybody talks about leafy greens and broccoli, and I'm not going to diss those. You can include those too, those count. But from a concentration standpoint, by weight, liver is the most concentrated source of folate. The controversy around liver is about vitamin A. We have these studies from the 1990s that supplemented pregnant women with high doses of synthetic vitamin A and observed a slightly increased rate of certain birth defects in those women. And so that's why there's an upper limit of 10,000 IUs of vitamin A, preformed vitamin A per day in pregnancy. Granted, they did not test liver specifically. And so we do know there's differences in the metabolism of food source nutrients versus synthetic nutrients that might have a different structure, and also like they're not provided with a full array of complementary nutrients that you'd be getting in food. I still am, on the play it safe side, so I'm not going to tell anybody to exceed 10,000 IUs of preformed vitamin A per day. But I think we have taken the advice about avoiding excessive amounts of vitamin A to the point it's kind of like the fish and seafood and mercury conversation. It's like, okay, this thing could be harmful, therefore eat none of it. There's a lot of OBs who are still telling people not to eat any fish or seafood during pregnancy because of mercury. And the same thing kind of goes for the liver conversation, even more so though. No liver, no pate in pregnancy whatsoever, because you might get too much vitamin A. And it's like you start looking at how much liver you actually need to take in to exceed that 10,000 IUs. I mean, certainly liver is very nutrient dense, so it would be possible. But on average, if you're looking at vitamin A over the course of a week, you're not going to exceed that if you eat 3 to 6 ounces of liver per week. And I personally have never once had a single client who ate more than 3 to 6 ounces of liver per week. Why? Because it is a self-limiting food. It has a very rich flavor. And some people really don't like it, obviously, especially if you didn't grow up eating it like me. It's taken me a while to get used to eating it. But it's gym talk. Yeah, it's something that most people are not exceeding. And the relative risk of having a birth defect related to vitamin A excess is very, very slim. Only 20 cases have been documented in the last 30 years. I just did a research brief on this on Instagram. Whereas we have these other birth defects that are associated with vitamin A deficiency, which you start looking at the data on vitamin A deficiency, upwards of 80% of pregnant women in the United States, from a wide economic background, by the way. This isn't just people who are unable to afford enough food. We're talking across the population. 80% are not getting enough vitamin A. And the rates of those specific birth defects, one of the major ones that's been linked to low vitamin A is congenital diaphragmatic hernia. And the rates of that have been over 1 million in the last 30 years. So tell me again, what is our risk benefit ratio here? Sure, we can talk about safe levels of a nutrient. I don't want anybody to exceed that or get to unsafe territory. And arguably the 10,000 IU cap is probably set very conservatively. There's some research who have not shown any higher rate of birth defects until you start getting over 30,000 IUs per day. And that would be a massive quantity of liver to consume. So I think we just have to, have a little bit more of a nuanced conversation. I find that, incorporating 3 to 6 ounces of liver a week, and oftentimes people aren't doing this every single week. You're lucky if you can get, even for me, who's a huge advocate of eating liver, I might get it 2-3 times a month. Sometimes it's not every week. I try to make a meal that has liver in it once a week, if possible, but I'm not getting anywhere close to even 6 ounces of liver a week, because it's a self-limiting food. You get tired of it and you move on. But I can at least acknowledge that it's extremely nutrient dense. So I do go out of my way to try to incorporate it every once in a while. I think we've just way overblown the safety concerns on it.
Yeah, I love it. I think easy ways to incorporate it. Pâtés are wonderful. You can put ground organ meat in your ground beef, which we eat a couple times a week. You can also do desiccated organ supplements. That's how I usually get most of mine. I'm horrible at remembering to take anything. So I put it on my desk at work. And then when I get a little moment of like ADD, I take my organ supplements and drink some water and then refocus.
That's awesome. Yeah, my article goes through a bunch of different ways to incorporate liver, some of the ones you mentioned, and there's some others as well if you need some ideas, because that's the hard part. It's like, how do you incorporate it? I know some people grew up like eating, liver and onions once a week at grandma's house, and so they like the flavor and they're happy to eat it. And then a lot of people, like myself included, it's kind of hard to get it down the hatch like straight up. I've been working on it for 15 plus years, and I'm still not really there to the level where I see liver at the store and I'm like, I'd love to have that for dinner. So it's usually hidden in ground meat dishes in our house as well.
Do you lose a lot of the nutrient content by cooking it?
You lose some, but certainly it doesn't make it a not nutrient dense food suddenly, right? You'll lose some of the B vitamins. Some of them are more heat sensitive. Folate is one that's pretty heat sensitive. Vitamin C is certainly very heat sensitive, but a lot of nutrients are not going to change whatsoever with the cooking. Like the minerals aren't going to change at all. The choline won't decrease much. So it's still going to be nutrient dense. I'm not really there with the raw liver thing, but certainly if you're doing a desiccated liver supplement, technically that hasn't been cooked. It's been like freeze dried. So that could be an option too.
When I first started adding liver in, I tried it raw. Like I would just cut it up in these little tiny cubes and throw a bunch of Redmond real salt on it, and I would just swallow it. And I would get this like, those 5-hour energy drinks, I would get this just like robust energy effect after I would do the raw liver. And so then like I kept coming back for more, and I would do it, 3 times a week. And then I kind of burnt out a little bit and then switched to doing more desiccated, and I don't get the same response. And I think it probably is just the
that's interesting. Yeah, there are some things that are certainly higher when it's eaten raw. So you could do it if you're brave enough. I've tried that before too, and I couldn't keep up with the whole.
Yeah, you have to cut them in small chunks and then, chase it with some water or whatever. But yeah. Okay, well, let's wrap up this end part. I want to talk about gestational diabetes and ketones again, and ketones in pregnancy, because it's such a controversial topic. Everybody knows I end my podcast with something called the semen analysis. And Lily, I had told her about this study, and she's, of course, totally familiar with it. But I pulled this study called Ketone Body Elevation in Placenta, Umbilical Cord, Newborn, and Mother in Normal Delivery. And this was a publication from Japan in September of 2016 that looked at 60 normal pregnant women who had normal full-term deliveries with no abnormal glucose intolerance. So these were not gestational diabetics. These were just normal, healthy mothers and babies. And they looked at ketone body concentrations in the placenta, tissue, the maternal blood, and the umbilical cord, and then compared those with glucose values. And of course, they found that there's a robust amount of ketones created in the placenta. There's ketones in the umbilical cord, and they followed these neonates for, I believe it was 30 days after life. And babies utilize these ketones as part of the myelination in the brain. Ketones are, I felt like it was beat into me when I went through my medical training that they're just pathologic. They're pathologic. Ketones are pathologic. Dip the pregnant woman's urine, because ketones in the urine means that there's some sort of pathology happening. Lily, what's your take on, I mean, you are obviously well-versed in the research in this area, but can you just talk about ketones in pregnancy? Are they dangerous? Are they not?
Yeah, so I actually pulled up some slides from a presentation I did recently on this with a screenshot of a study, a table from that exact study. This is a topic I've looked at pretty deeply, because that was talking about ketones and different types of ketosis and what's safe and what's not was paramount to me writing Real Food for Gestational Diabetes and ever recommending a lower carbohydrate diet during pregnancy, because that's really the main argument against low carb, is that you might produce ketones. Sure, there might be concerns about fat intake or something like that, but most of it surrounds ketones. There is a strongly held belief that the presence of ketones or state of ketosis could harm fetal brain development, even though the data used to support that is
A rat study.
Well, it comes from two places if we want to get into it. Like you have a study from the late 60s that measured urine ketones on admittance to the hospital for labor and infant APGAR scores. Okay, so first of all, urine ketones don't correlate with blood ketones, particularly during pregnancy. So you actually keep blood ketone levels at a pretty narrow range, and any excess spills into your urine. So it doesn't actually mean anything. You can spill almost no ketones and be mildly ketotic in your blood, or you can spill lots of ketones and be mildly ketotic in your blood. And then there was another one from the early 90s, which I've been meaning to like write about this in more detail and really pick it apart. But they suggested that any presence of ketones is linked to neurodevelopmental problems in baby. Interestingly, the participants, first of all, ketone levels weren't all that much different between the participants, but they included women who had pre-existing diabetes, like type 1 diabetes, gestational diabetes, and you could see from their data that both of those groups were really poorly controlled. And then another group of normal, so-called normal non-diabetic pregnant women. I'd have to like open up the study to get into the details, but essentially the levels of ketones that they were suggesting were harmful was like 0.1 millimoles per liter, which is very much mild normal state of ketosis in pregnancy. So there's a lot suspect about that. And this Japanese study actually picks apart that one a little bit.
Yeah, they had it. Yeah, it's on page 138, but yeah, it was Rizzo et al. The study. Yeah, it was ketone levels of 0.1. Most of the people had unstable glucose profiles, elevated postprandial glucose and glycemic excursions, and then oxidative stress associated with,
I will say there's so few studies that look at blood ketones in pregnancy that it's really hard to make sense of any of the literature. There was one that very recently came out, I believe, out of Australia, and they assigned women to a regular high carb diet versus so-called low carb diet, but they only ended up eating 165 grams of carbs a day, so not really low carb. And they both had 0.1 mils per liter of ketones, right? The level that the Rizzo study said was so harmful. The reason this Japanese study is so helpful and adds to our understanding of this is that they were looking at non-diabetic women. They measured blood ketones, they measured it in baby, they measured it in the placenta. And by the way, the umbilical cord levels of ketones were like 7-fold higher than maternal levels of ketones. And the placental tissue fluid was by far the highest in ketone levels, more than twice, maybe 2.5. I'm guesstimating right here with my math, more than the umbilical cord levels, which would be baby's blood supply. So we have evidence that the placenta itself engages in ketogenesis. It creates ketones and preferentially transfers them to baby. 30% of brain energy needs in the fetus are met by ketones. So what are we saying they're harmful? If babies remain in ketosis for at least the first month of life, and we do have data going beyond that showing that breastfed babies are still in mild ketosis beyond that, by the way, how would it make physiological sense that something was damaging neurodevelopmentally during pregnancy, but that at the point of delivery and beyond, suddenly you're in ketosis and it's okay? That doesn't make sense. Why would the female body naturally go into a state of ketosis 3 times more readily during pregnancy than outside of pregnancy? If that was truly pathological, our species would not be here today. Right. If people truly required 175 grams of carbohydrates per day to have a successful pregnancy with a non-brain injured child, how do you explain these populations, such as the Inuit and other people living sort of at extreme latitudes with very long winters and essentially almost no plant foods over the course of winter, low carb intakes, like 5 to 15% of calories maybe? How are they able to reproduce? And how are those children not all, with developmental problems? I mean, there's a lot of holes to pick in the whole logic of this. I actually devote a whole chapter in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes to this topic because it's so controversial, and because I still to this day get women coming to me saying, oh my gosh, my doctor's on me because I have ketones in my urine and they're telling me I need to eat more carbs or that I'm under eating. And I'm always coming back with, did they check your blood ketone levels? Because the urine ketones mean nothing. I can tell you for both of my pregnancies, and I by all means was not eating keto, but was eating relatively low carb. I was positive for urine ketones almost every single visit. Sometimes I'd even eat extra carbs prior to the visit to like try to not be spilling ketones because I didn't want to have the conversation. It was just too annoying. And that's me, the one who like has all the data on this. It's just too annoying. You don't want to like
you feel
hurt
like you have to
anybody's ego. You don't want to like be the problem patient or whatever. But I was spilling ketones pretty frequently. And my kids I have 2 kids and they've both exceeded all of their developmental milestones. Certainly no sign of brain injury there. And they were not growth restricted. They were both like 8 pounds, totally healthy, fine. You know, all the arguments against it being problematic just don't actually pan out in real life. And there was actually a 2021 review on this topic that was actually very reassuring. They came to pretty much all the same conclusions that I came to in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, because they're reviewing a lot of the same evidence that I did, which was that there's no strong basis for the avoidance of ketones in pregnancy. There's no strong basis for the recommendation of 175 grams of carbohydrates per day. And we really don't have enough data to be advising women against a low carbohydrate diet if that's optimizing their glucose control. So it came to the same, conclusions. Here we are, like, 7 years later since the publishing of Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and we're like still waiting for that data to catch up.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. This conversation has been refreshing, and I take care of a lot of women who, I even have some people that eat very low carb. I mean, that's just how they felt good and they got pregnant and they've had healthy pregnancies and healthy babies. And I actually don't send my diabetics to the gestational diabetes educators anymore. I do everything myself. And just because I know that will improve outcomes. And I had one patient in the last couple of years that needed medication that couldn't be controlled with dietary intervention. And sometimes it means lowering it a lot lower than recommendations. But like I said, at the end of the day, normal glucose levels, normal insulin levels help produce healthy babies. I mean, there are absolute dangers to hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia. So, pick your
poison, I guess.
Poison.
But
Yeah.
I agree with you. The other interesting thing is that from a micronutrient perspective, carbohydrate quality is the number one predictor of micronutrient intake in pregnant women. So the more that your diet is made of low quality carbs, mostly like white flour, white rice, added sugar, just the processed ones that have no extra micronutrients in there, that's the number one predictor of inadequate micronutrient intake. So if you do anything, even if you're not going to go super low carb, if you just really cut back on those low nutrient carbohydrate sources, by default, your diet quality is better. And I'd argue by default, your blood sugar readings, insulin, and all of that is also going to be significantly better. That really tends to be the major driver of blood sugar spikes. And I think people need to understand with gestational diabetes, it's very much on a spectrum of blood sugar control, in that it's not just like a label that determines risk, it's how well your blood sugar is controlled. Even if you pass a glucose screening and you so-called don't have gestational diabetes, you can still have significant blood sugar swings. You might have just happened to have really excellent insulin production on that day to drop your number down in time, but that doesn't mean that it's without risks. We have a lot of studies on glycemic variability, how much you spike and crash in pregnancy, even outside of the scope of gestational diabetes, linking it to adverse outcomes. So I'm a huge advocate of blood sugar balance for everybody in pregnancy, outside of pregnancy. It makes such a difference on your overall health.
Yeah, I wish I could put CGMs on all my pregnant patients. Sometimes I can get it covered and sometimes I can't, but I just think it's such valuable information to have.
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan of it too.
Wave my magic wand, it would measure ketones. But I've talked to all the brilliant medical science software type people, and it's hard to measure ketones in the interstitial fluid. So
I've asked about that too, as well as insulin. Wouldn't it be cool to have like continuous insulin monitoring? And the technology is not quite there yet. Yeah, I'm a big fan of CGM. A lot of the women I work with gestational diabetes will try to get one. A lot of them end up paying out of pocket, and it's honestly a lot of times worth it. If you are,
if you're the type, who wants to put their finger 4 times a day?
Oh my gosh. And then if you're the type who really wants to get a handle on your glucose patterns, sometimes they're pricking themselves like 12 plus times a day. I want to check before a meal, 1 hour, 2 hour. I want to check at bedtime before I go to sleep. I'm going to check at 3 a.m. to see if what's happening overnight. And so those test strips add up. And sometimes the CGM actually ends up being less expensive.
Totally.
Some countries you can get them over the counter at the pharmacy. The US, you still need a prescription, and there's, controversy around using it in pregnancy or not. But I wore one during my second pregnancy, each trimester, to see where I was at. I always treat myself like a science experiment. And
always.
I didn't find that it was, it was not off from my meter any more than CGMs are always going to be maybe 5 to 10 points different at like a single time point, because there's like a delay in the interstitial fluid, and Libras can run just a teeny bit low, but it was always within 5 to 10 milligrams per deciliter for me, and it seemed accurate. And I've seen much better outcomes when we use CGM, because you could have something like, good example of this is dates, and I'm going to be writing an article on dates. People eat dates in preparation for labor. Have you heard of this? Yeah. So dates are a great example for somebody like me who's pretty metabolically healthy. Baseline, probably low insulin, but I can handle a blood sugar spike pretty well. Dates, I think they spiked me 70 or 80 points. I'd have to look back at the CGM data. I was back down to the normal range at an hour though. So if I was just checking at a single time point, I'd be like, that was fine. It was no problem. But for a person who usually goes maybe 10, 20 at a high carb meal, maybe 30 points above baseline, and kind of a slow rise and a slow fall, a spike of 70 points and back down within an hour is extremely stressful on your body. It is a major problem. That's a major blood sugar spike that baby is being exposed to, first of all, which is the major risk factor for baby, because that's when their insulin production kicks in. So we have these babies that are hyperinsulinemic and born insulin resistant, and are facing a 6 to 19-fold higher risk of type 2 diabetes, because what is their pancreas programmed to do? Pump out huge amounts of insulin to handle these huge insulin spikes. So if we had CGMs on people, I think we'd be getting a lot more data than, single time point glucose tolerance testing, or even just finger pricking. We didn't even get to talk about the HAPO trial and other awesome studies like that. Maybe we'll have to have a part 2. Oh yeah, I could talk about that.
So much for your time, and I hope everybody, and I know people are going to get a lot of information about this. Tell people how they can find you, how they can find your books and your blogs and those types of things.
Yeah, so main hub is my website. So it's Lily Nichols RDN. There is a tab that links out to my books. You can see where to get those. There's a tab for my blog. There's a tab for freebies. You can get the first chapter of Real Food for Pregnancy for free there if you want it, but lots of stuff linked there. And then as far as social media, you can find me on Instagram. Handles the same as my website, Lily Nichols RDN, but I really keep the meaty content is mostly on my blog. There's a handy little search bar. You could search protein or liver or choline, and you'll pull up some articles related to what we were talking about today.
I love it. Lily, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for listening. Make sure you download this episode, share it. People, leave us your reviews. It really helps us spread this message all over the world. Have a great day.